Who discovered the Americas is a familiar question in the elementary school quizzes. The answer to this question, Christopher Columbus, is one of the most popular figures in history credited with the discovery of the New World. Columbus was portrayed as a hero and a pioneer navigator by the early historians like Washington Irving, taking great pains in his journeys and turning odds to unite the Americas with the rest of the world. Though this perception of Columbus has been challenged by recent historiographical traditions who scrutinized his expeditions more critically. The recent works acknowledging the maritime skills of Columbus also address the negative impacts of his voyages, including the brutal treatment of the indigenous people. Life in the Americas before the arrival of Columbus was one in conformity with nature, characterized by a profound respect for the natural world. Many indigenous societies viewed nature as sacred and held a strong spiritual connection to the land, rivers, mountains, and other natural elements. They often practiced animism, believing that spirits inhabited plants, animals, and natural phenomena. These civilizations relied on sustainable practices for hunting, fishing, and agriculture, often utilizing intricate knowledge of local ecosystem to ensure their survival. The age of discovery starting in the 15th century led to many European nations embarking on extensive maritime voyages to explore, discover, and establish trade routes to distant lands. European nations sought new trade routes to access valuable goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals. The lucrative trade in these commodities provided economic incentives for exploration, and advances in shipbuilding, navigation, and cartography, including the development of the caravel and improvements in the navigational instruments like the compass and astrolabe, made long distance sea voyages more feasible. The European powers were also motivated by religious zeal to spread Christianity to new lands. This missionary impulse was a great factor in the exploration and colonization of the Americas. Columbus embarked on his first voyage from Spain in August 1492 with three ships named the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. On October 12, 1492, Columbus made landfall on an island in the Bahamas which he named San Salvador. Later, he explored several other islands in the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola. During his journey, Columbus encountered several indigenous tribes, including the Taino people, and he mistakenly believed he had reached the East Indies, hence referring to the inhabitants as Indians. He returned to Spain in March 1493. With him, he brought back gold, parrots, and indigenous captives, sparking excitement and interest in further exploration.
During his second voyage, Columbus departed from Spain in September 1493 with a fleet of 17 ships. He revisited Hispaniola and established the first Spanish colony in the Americas named La Isabela. This marked the beginning of European colonization in the New World. Columbus explored more extensively during his second voyage, discovering and mapping several islands in the Caribbean. These explorations helped to further solidify Spanish claims to the region and laid the groundwork for future efforts towards colonization. Throughout his voyage, his relations with the indigenous populations were complex, with instances of both cooperation and conflict. Columbus returned to Spain in June 1496, concluding his second voyage. Although he faced criticism and challenges from within Europe, including accusations of mismanagement and mistreatment of colonists, his achievements during the expedition further fueled European interest in exploration and colonization of the Americas.
The primary objective of Columbus's third voyage was to continue his search for the westward route to Asia and to explore further south along the coast of the Americas. He aimed to find gold, spices, and valuable resources to fulfill his promises to the Spanish monarchs and to enrich himself. Columbus's third voyage was marred by conflicts and difficulties. Accusations of mismanagement, cruelty, and incompetence led to his arrest and eventual return to Spain in 1500. After all he had done for the sovereigns over the course of the 3 years, to be treated this way was way beyond imagination and reason for him. This is evidenced in the letter that he sent to the governess of Don Juan of Castile in 1500. Donna Juana de Torres was the sister of his friend Antonio de Torres and the former nurse of Prince Juan. So Columbus knew that the contents of his letter would reach the king and queen without risking royal displeasure by directly questioning royal authority. He goes on lengths about the injustices done to him. Similar complaints of ingratitude and injustice would color his writings for the rest of his life. He insists on being judged as governor of the uncivilized Indians and not the Europeans, argues Lawrence Bergreen. Columbus's fourth voyage took him to the coasts of Central America, including present-day Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama. He encounters tribes of Chontals, Lencas, Arawak, etc. Despite his efforts, Columbus failed to find the riches he sought or a viable westward route to Asia. He faced resistance from both the indigenous people and his own crew, who grew increasingly disillusioned with his leadership. In 1504, Columbus returned to Spain, his ambitions unfulfilled and his health deteriorating. His fourth voyage marked the end of his career as an explorer and the beginning of a period of decline and obscurity for the once celebrated navigator.
The initial competition among European nations began with the Spanish and Portuguese. After Columbus's discovery, which was sponsored by Spain, the Portuguese quickly sought to secure their own routes and territories into the New World. This early rivalry was temporarily resolved by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which divided the newly discovered lands outside Europe between the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire. However, this agreement did little to quell the growing ambitions of other European powers. By the 16th century, other European powers, including France, England, and the Netherlands, began to challenge Spanish and Portuguese supremacy in the Americas.
It is important to look at the sources that detail Columbus's interest in exploring the possibility of land existing outside of the known world. These include several treatises that he signed in agreement, particularly for funding his travels. For instance, on April 17, 1492, he signed an article of agreement with the Spanish monarchy, a document that still survives. So this document with a certain legal bearing accorded him titles like Admiral, Viceroy, and Governor General of all islands and mainlands that he was to thereafter discover and acquire. This document also lists the compensation that Columbus was to receive in return for the islands that he had not even found yet.
To furnish details about Columbus' voyages were his personal diaries. Though these diaries were lost, contemporary translations of them were crucial in retaining the first-hand account of his voyages. These give an insight into his intentions and ambitions, which were sometimes even religious, in pursuing such a quest. Later on, in one of his diary entries, he writes about how were unaware of the idea of a religion but was not inherently evil either. Hence, he took upon himself the role of bringing them within the fold of the Catholic faith. Often sighting of birds and weeds, algae were taken as indications of the closeness of land when on a journey. The crew's unease with the extreme duration of the voyage was dealt with a Solomon upper hand. This journey gives cinematic details of not just the new land discovered in October 1492 but also the natives that inhabited these lands. At first, he majorly communicated with the natives using hand gestures, while the records mentions that a native had approached Columbus' fleet with the intention of bartering. Soon after, there are sufficient mentions of them on board his ships. This probably was to scout for even more new lands, often to describe the natives paternalistic terms like domesticable and tacticable. As much as he appreciated the plant life of these origins, his intention of acquiring from them what was precious to the European prevailed. Details pertaining to the beginning of the fourth voyage can be furnished by analyzing the letter that authorized the same, which was written on March 14, 1502. In it, they retreated their displeasure about Columbus' imprisonment, assured him that his claims in the New World would be passed on his heirs, and told him to sail as quick as possible. It was common knowledge that Columbus had been ill frequently since his return from Hispaniola. The fatalistic tone of the sovereign's farewell letter make it clear they didn't accept the admiral to return. It was a small-scale operation where Columbus was provided with bad ship and an inexperienced crew. Hence, it was obvious that the monarchy was not expecting much from the voyage.
Columbus wrote to the sovereigns while stranded in Jamaica, and this gives an overview of his travel, which paints a very clear picture of the routes and journeys he undertook, and he then proceeds to lament about his situation, hoping to be rescued from the island. Along with Columbus' account, his son Ferdinand's work, quote unquote, The Life of the Admiral Christopher Columbus by his son Ferdinand, also sheds light on their expeditions. Through these works, we find that his greed for finding riches prevailed. For instance, upon meeting the Continental Mayans, he ordered his men to seize their boats' possessions. Columbus refrained from taking slaves, realizing that few actions would infuriate Isabella more. Instead, he took an older man named Yombe as a prisoner, whom he intended on using as his translator with other tribes he might encounter. Yombe was later returned to shore when he no longer spoke the local language and had to walk back home alone. Despite the several setbacks that came in the way of the fourth voyage, including the growing disinterest of his fellow crewmen, his intent to find a route to Asia persisted. However, this did not materialize as they were not equipped to march 9 days through a potentially hostile jungle to reach the other ocean. The crews were now so broken that they prayed for death to replace them for their martyrdom. With these words, Columbus officially gave up the hunt for the westward passage. By the time of the fourth voyage, his perception of the natives also undergoes a significant shift when compared to his general record in the first voyage. His treatment of the natives was far more cruel, as he was focused primarily on finding the relevant routes and accumulating as much wealth as possible, blaming all of it on their uncivilized nature. This was fueled also because he understood that his voyage would be compared with those of Ojeda and Bastards. He ends his letter and journey in a state of abandonment. While his true feelings can never be known, we cannot overlook the possibility of exaggeration to generate sympathy.
Columbus's expeditions to the Americas have retained their hold over popular memory as a watershed moment in world history. Despite academic and ideological efforts towards reckoning with the racially, environmentally, and socioculturally oppressive legacies of colonialism, the traditional narrative of Columbus as a visionary discovering uncharted territories continues to obscure the complex realities of his voyages and the trauma that indigenous communities still contend with today. To understand why Columbus the hero sustains his popularity, we will critically and comparatively analyze two separate documentaries on his first and fourth voyages, both reflecting upon history through the brand of Christopher Columbus. America Before Columbus is a two-part documentary that explores life in America and Europe on the eve of the first voyage and addresses the power dynamics that enable the European discovery of America, subsequent civilizational clashes, and environmental refashioning. While its stance seems to be critical of the transformative impact of European arrivals in the Americas, the documentary retains a distinctly Eurocentric framework. Here, the Europe of 1491 is described as a continent of expanding horizons, filled with competitive and inventive souls seeking riches and land. Europe's land poverty is greatly elaborated upon, and the abundant landscape and resources of the Americas are presented as the central motivator for European fascination with the New World. Commendably, the documentary distances itself from the centrality of Columbus and acknowledges the socio-political atmosphere of the 15th century, the role of technology, printing press, and religious fervor in facilitating the age of discovery. While European exploitation of natural resources is disparaged, the documentary carefully stresses that Native American practices, though more sustainable, were not always harmonious with the natural world. The exploration of indigenous cultures is limited despite the focus on the complexity and diversity of Native American societies, the agricultural practices, trade networks, and environmental stewardship.
In its second part, the documentary provides a more nuanced understanding of the complex legacy of European explorations by turning its attention towards the histories of environmental exploitation and degradation, unequal cultural exchange, and economic and social injustice. The documentary recounts how Columbus's voyage inspired European populations to brave the Atlantic to claim their share in the newfound treasure. Thus began a catastrophic era for the Native Americans as they were subjected to conquest that annihilated entire civilizations, as well as deadly European diseases such as the smallpox, which contaminated the entire continent. The ecosystem was colonized too, as Europeans cleared indigenous forests for timber and planted European trees. Overfishing depleted American seas, and colonization of indigenous crops such as potatoes and corn profoundly benefited European diets and economies. wheat, weeds, and bees were introduced to America, and the influx of European cattle disrupted indigenous agricultural practices and triggered food scarcity and conflict. Violence was thus engineered on all levels of existence, ultimately driven by power and the pursuit of wealth, which would establish institutions of exploitation like African slavery and ultimately the introduction of traditions of oppressions that continue to shape marginalized experiences today. The documentary we selected to discuss the fourth voyage is called Columbus the Lost Voyage, and it chooses to engage with different themes than the first documentary. It presents a detailed narratives of the voyages and focuses primarily on his motivations, challenges, and eventual failures, thus reverting to the tradition of studying history through the central struggling personality. However, the documentary adopts a critical perspective of Columbus's action, character, and ambition. The portrayal of Columbus as a flawed, morally ambiguous, and ultimately unsuccessful figure reflects a reinterpretation of his legacy within the context of the devastating impact of colonization on indigenous populations, which the narrative underscores by emphasizing on the spread of disease, rampant conflict, and exploitation of Native Americans. The documentary concludes with an assessment of Columbus's legacy and the ongoing efforts to reevaluate his historical significance. By focusing on the perspective of his contemporaries and his successors to shape his heritage, the documentary contemplates the broader debates around how historical figures are to be remembered and their actions interpreted.
The memory of Christopher Columbus remains a deeply contested terrain. His celebration as a hero implies a societal tendency to mythologize history and obfuscate historical injustices. This is challenged by Columbus, The Lost Voyage, while America Before Columbus examines the socio-political and environmental impacts of European exploration. Ultimately, both documentaries contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of what Columbus stands for in history. Critically engaging with these narratives can only help work towards what remains silenced in history and repressed in the memory.
The figure of Columbus has been integral to American mythology ever since its birth. Not only are 15 places named after him, but also a holiday in the national calendar commemorates his first western landfall. He's been interpreted in various ways in historiography, reflecting the evolving societal norms, academic methodologies, and cultural attitudes, making him a very dynamic and contested field within American history. In the late 1700s, a young nation attempting to find its heroes certainly found one in Columbus, glorified by William Robertson and Jeremy Belknap as a daring explorer with courage, vision, and determination in seeking new trade routes to Asia. Washington Irving of the 19th century too portrayed Columbus as a heroic and virtuous figure driven by a visionary quest. He emphasized his apparent noble character, perseverance, and romanticized adventures in the New World. Through poetic prose, Irving crafted an idealized image of Columbus, reflecting the very much prevalent romantic ideals of the age. In the mid-19th century, though Columbus's skill and adventure continued to be admired, his morality now came to be questioned by Jacob Abbott, noting that there was this strange incongruity in the motives which seemed to actuate him. An exalted religious enthusiasm, which seemed sometimes quite sublime, mingling with a very eager appetite for worldly wealth and power. His flaws were increasingly highlighted in Justin Winsor's work, which dealt with his desire for fame and fortune, his misrepresentations of what he found across the ocean, and his maladministration in the Indies. Despite all this, anti-Spanish prejudice seems to have grown stronger during the 19th century as legacies of the Mexican and Spanish-American wars. There was increased Catholic glorification minimizing his excesses. In the 1920s, though, the progressives approached the study of Columbus with a critical lens. They utilized methods such as archival research, comparative analysis, and interdisciplinary approaches, emphasizing the social economic context and considering the impact of colonization on indigenous peoples and the broader implications on global history, moving away from simplistic hero worship towards a more nuanced appraisal of his historical significance.
Samuel Eliot Morison's significant contribution in 1942 coincided with the 450th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, presenting a comprehensive and erudite account of his life, portraying him as a skilled mariner and visionary explorer while also downplaying earlier romanticized views. Post-1960s, historiographical trends surrounding Columbus became more nuanced and diversified, increasingly portraying him as a figure associated with colonialism, exploitation, and genocide, reflecting broader societal shift in attitudes towards imperialism and racism. Furthermore, there was a growing recognition of the contribution and perspective of marginalized groups such as Native Americans and African Americans in shaping American history. This has led to a re evaluation with Columbus being depicted as less of a heroic explorer and more as a symbol of oppression and exploitation.
Recent scholarships continue to grapple with Columbus' legacy. The ongoing debate surrounding Columbus reflect broader tensions within American historiography, including questions of representation, identity, and historical memory. Thus, critical discourse analyze an interdisciplinary approach to analyze language and communication in various social contexts, leave how it reflects and shapes power relations, ideologies, and social structures. CDA draws from the theories such as post-structuralism, brutalism, socialism, and neo-Marxist culture theory to explore how discourse constructs identities, enforce norms, and perpetuate inequalities. By scrutinizing language used in text, speech, and media, we can cover hidden meanings, implicit biases, and socio-political implications, ultimately contributing to a deeper understanding of socialite dynamics and the reproduction of power.
Despite cognizance of varying views, in a majority of works surrounding Columbus, language choices such as the use of terms like discover, new world, new continent serve to legitimize European colonization while marginalizing the experiences of Native Americans. The Eurocentric narrative of the European superiority and entitlement to land is reinforced. This linguistic framing perpetuates a colonialist discourse that downplays the devastating impacts of colonization, such as genocide, displacement of the native population, while also perpetuating myths and stereotypes against the latter, validating both the past and present European hegemony. Ultimately, the above analysis calls for a more critical and inclusive approach to history, recognizing diverse perspectives and experiences, including those of Native Americans and other marginalized groups impacted by colonization. By deconstructing Eurocentric narratives and interrogating linguistic and textual representations, the history of Columbus can move towards a more nuanced understanding of the past that acknowledges the complexities and legacies of colonialism and fosters empathy and understanding towards diverse cultures and people.